Hey guys, we are back updating the power rankings for Hell's Kitchen, Head Chefs Only, following episode 3. A pretty eventful episode, all things considered. It definitely led to some pretty interesting results, but we'll get to that soon enough. But we have 17 chefs to talk about, and to waste some more time, let's go right into the video. So starting off at number 17, we have the first boot from this week, and here we have Shawn. And obviously, Shawn has a very unfortunate exit here with him sustaining an injury during the morning punishment that results in him being pulled from the game. And obviously, it's a shame to lose him this early. You never want to see anyone going out in this fashion. Now, obviously, Shawn was someone who I was slipping on considering how bad his first service was, and he wasn't exactly someone I was looking at as a high contender to where even if he had stayed in the game, he probably would have been taken out around like service 7 or 8, kind of like the mid pre-Black Jackets phase. And I didn't really see him as a contender there, but to lose him this early is pretty shocking and pretty unfortunate. But he's now out of the game to where he's here at number 17. Now moving on to number 16, and we have the second boot from this week, and here we have Yuri. And this was probably an even bigger shock than Shawn, considering I expected Yuri to be a big character in the season, someone who was going to be this villain, someone who was going to get into a lot of conflict with the rest of his team, and someone who would have been a pretty fun presence across the season, except he ends up going out on a whimper here with him also getting injured and having to pull himself from the competition. Again, very unfortunate result here, and even more surprising than the Shawn one, considering this means that we are losing 2 people before the dinner service, which is pretty shocking there. And I feel like with how big Yuri's edit was across these episodes, I was expecting him to be in there a bit longer, but it just wasn't meant to be. But obviously he's now also out of the game to where he's here at number 16. Now moving on to number 15, and we have yet another person who is now out of the game, and that is Corbin. And I was actually pretty shocked that Corbin actually went home here, considering we already lost Shawn and Yuri, 2 people before dinner service, 2 people from the same team in fact, and at that point I was expecting it to be a non-elim where it would be like a fake out. But instead, Ramsey actually pulled the trigger and actually cut Corbin, meaning this is the first time in Hell's Kitchen where we had 3 boots in a single episode, and a pretty massive swing for the blue team here where they came into the episode up 1 person, but now they're down 2. Though I will say that out of the noms here, I think Corbin going makes the most sense. He was someone I was very low on across the entire season, where in episode 1, while he got this very profound personal content, it was just kind of brushed aside, like they were just kind of skirting past it, and not really something that we as an audience are meant to get that attached to. And then in episode 2, he kind of has a negative edit with him talking about being cool as a cucumber, only to immediately make a mistake. And obviously this episode was another pretty bad service for him, where he ends up talking about how he likes to make sexy dishes only to screw up the scallops, and then he gets moved over to the meat station but doesn't do anything. It's called the Statue of Liberty. And again, just made all the sense in the world for Corbin to be cut here. He always felt like a pretty under the radar person, and even then wasn't getting propped up that much. So while Corbin being an early boot doesn't shock me that much, the fact that it happened in this episode after we had already lost 2 people is pretty shocking, and obviously not something I was expecting in this episode. But obviously Corbin's now out of the game to where he's here at number 15. And with that, we have 14 people left in the game to talk about, and as usual, I'll be ranking them based on how lucky I think they are to win the game based off their edit and current game position. But at number 14, the person I believe is the least likely to win from this point on is Britney. Now, I'll be honest, I'm not that low on Britney, all things considered. I feel like the main reason she's at the bottom for me, though, is that she does have a pretty bad service here where she does screw up a flatbread, and we have a lot of our team not really talking that favorably about her. And I feel like mixing that in with her content not impressing me that much, where I felt like a lot of it was circumstantial, it wouldn't shock me if Britney is towards the bottom of the pecking order on the red team, and it's just a matter of time before she gets cut. But I feel like considering she has a pretty bad service here, considering she is on the winning team, I do feel like Britney's someone I'm not feeling that great about at this current moment, which is why she's here at number 14. Now moving on to number 13, and we have someone who I had even lower last week, but now they're higher. But number 13, we do have Magali. And Magali has a pretty mixed bag of an episode, all things considered, where on one hand, she does get decent personal content here, where at the beginning of the episode, we talk about her surviving the blog, which leads into her talking about her husband and how he's super supportive of her. We even get their wedding photo, and it just felt like a lot for Magali to be getting out of nowhere. And I felt like it could have been a decent turning point for her to start being a more competent chef, except she ends up doing pretty poorly in the challenge afterwards, where she talks about thinking outside the box and wanting to do something creative, only for it to just completely blow up in her face, and she kind of loses a point for her team there, which is not great. And while her service is kind of whatever, I feel like the fact that she did pretty poorly in the challenge after getting all this personal content is not the greatest look in my eyes. And considering how she was pretty low in my previous power rankings, I did decide to leave her around the same spot at number 13. Now moving on to number 12, and we have someone who I still have pretty low at the end of the day, but number 12 we do have Michael. Now, Michael's a weird case, as I feel like Michael's actually a pretty competent chef from what we've been seeing. He hasn't really had a bad service yet, where he does pretty well in the challenge, does pretty well in the service for the most part, where he's shown actively making a good dish. But I feel like Michael's another person who is not really being propped up that much in the edit, where a lot of his focus is about him talking about how Egypt is annoying. And with us not really knowing much about Michael in particular, mixing that in with the fact that he had a pretty shaky service one, I feel like Michael's probably not primed to do well from a narrative perspective. I feel like he doesn't have nearly as much setup to being a major player in the season compared to plenty of other people, which is why despite him doing pretty well in the service, I still have him pretty low at the end of the day. I'm not really looking at him as a contender. So for those reasons, I do have him here at number 12. Now moving on to number 11, we have someone who I just mentioned, but number 11, we do have Egypt. And it's sort of funny seeing Egypt's fall from grace here, where I was so high on him after episode 1, I even picked him for my draft team, but he ends up just being this massive character, someone who's clearly meant to be this source of conflict with how domineering he is. And despite this, he's not even that good as a chef, where we see him making mistakes during the service as well. That results in him being nominated here. And at this point, I just don't see how he goes on to win the season, considering how shaky of a chef he's actually been, the actual services, mixing in the fact that a lot of his team simply doesn't like him. Now, there's definitely a debate for him being higher, considering due to him being the source of conflict, there's a very strong case that he could survive some rounds and have some longevity within him, simply due to him being like this source of entertainment for the show, and also someone that's at least attempting to be a leader. But while he could stick around due to him being this big character, I feel like it's not actually going to lead to a win by the end of it, where at some point you just have to let him go. And I feel like that's going to be Egypt by the end of it. But still, I feel like the fact that he's at least a bigger character than some of the people we already talked about was enough to have him here at number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and this person has been creeping up a bit on the rankings, but I'm still not feeling that great about them. But number 10, we do have Brandon. And Brandon is someone who has been getting more content on the show, though I also question how much of it is positive, considering we do see him making mistakes during the service once again, where you have him asking for 10 minutes on a dish, causing Corbin to be brought to a station, only for the dish to still turn out bad, which is not great there. And we see him being talked about as a nom, though he ends up avoiding the block there. And admittedly, I still don't think Brandon's a likely contender either. I feel like he's probably not winning either. But I feel like the fact that he at least has been getting more to do on the show and is someone who could be around for a bit is enough to have him above some of these other people, but still not feeling the best about him, so he's here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and this is someone who I did consider having lower, but at the end of the day, they didn't make any mistakes across the actual service. But number 9, we do have Anne-Marie, and Anne-Marie's kind of just been there for me. I feel like she doesn't really bring that much to the show, and I feel like she's probably not a contender either. But again, she at least did well across the episode. She did pretty well in the challenge. She did pretty well in the service. I can't really complain much with her at this point to have her much lower, but I feel like she's just kind of there for me, which is why she's here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we have another person who's kind of just there at this point, but we do have Amanda. And Amanda's another one who's been pretty under-edited, hasn't really done much good or bad, if I'm being perfectly honest. She does well in the challenge. She doesn't make any mistakes during the actual service. Her one confessional is about her being worried about Britney on the flatbread station, but beyond that, there's not really much to say about Amanda. But at the same time, there's not really enough to drag her down either, which is why she's here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we have another person who was just there in this episode, but we do have Joe. And Joe was just there. He did well in the challenge. He didn't make any mistakes during the service. That's really all there is to say. Now, you can definitely knock him for not getting to weigh in on the Yuri exit, where it did seem like Joe and Yuri could have had this rivalry, but Joe doesn't really say much when Yuri goes out there, so not too much to say there. But again, he at least has a bit more personal content than Anne-Marie or Amanda, which is why he's above them. But beyond that, there's not really much to say about Joe, so he's here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and we actually have the same top 6 as last week, and it's just a matter of ordering them. By number 6, we have the person who was at number 6 last week, and here we have Hannah. And Hannah got a fine episode here. Now, she does make a mistake during the service where she's shown being pretty slow and doesn't put the lentils into a dish. We see Ramsay getting into her face about it. However, we do see her fix it, and she also gets a confessional talking about how she needs to prove Ramsay wrong here. And again, I think that's all pretty good. Definitely enough to correct for that mistake. And I feel like Hannah didn't really do much to elevate my view of her, but also didn't do anything to make her go down, which is why she's staying around the same spot at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and we have the person who was at number 5 last week, but we do have Kyle. And Kyle got a bit more to do in this episode where we see him talking about how he grew up on the East Coast and how seafood is second nature to him, which leads to him doing pretty well in the challenge, which is all pretty good there. And beyond that, while he doesn't make any mistakes during the service, he does also complain about Egypt's ego and how meat and fish stations had to work together. So again, we do get their perspective during the challenge in the episode, but beyond that, I feel like this episode didn't really do anything to elevate my view of them either, which is why they're here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and this person was actually in number 2 last week, but they didn't make a mistake during the service that made me drop them a bit, but we do have Megan. And I still see Megan as a top contender. I feel like this was a decent episode for her where she does get the weigh in on the Shawn and Yuri exits. We're talking about how as a softball player, she had to sit out due to injury and she feels bad for Yuri. Though beyond that, she does make a mistake during the service by being slow in the kitchen. Admittedly, it's not much to knock her for, and at the end of the day, I still see Megan as a top contender, but I feel compared to the next couple people we'll be talking about, I do feel slightly better about them at this current point, which is why I did drop Megan here to number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and this person did move up by virtue of Megan going down, but we do have Lulu. And Lulu is still someone I see as a top contender as well, where while she does make a mistake during the challenge by losing the point there, we also get her perspective on it, talking about how she grew up as a soccer player and that she never wants to lose. And then she follows it up with a pretty decent service where we see her like being a good leader during the service, taking charge there, doing well as well. And of course, her team ends up winning the service. So again, it was a pretty good episode for Lulu by the end of it. And it does seem like she's about to be swapped over to the blue team if the next time on is anything to go by. So we'll see how she does there. But Lulu is still someone I'm seeing as a top contender at this current point, which is why she's here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and this is another person I was very high on last week, and I'm still high on them this week, but at number 2 we do have Whit. Now there's definitely a debate for Whit being lower as they don't do the best during the actual challenge, even though they do get a point where their dish wasn't the best. But she still has a pretty decent service. She doesn't make any mistakes there. She also gets a decent confessional about how her team has it in the bag and that they're good communicators, which is followed up by them having a relatively clean service, especially compared to the blue team. They end up outright winning that service. So again, it was a pretty good look for Whit there, and Whit is still someone I'm feeling pretty good about this current point, both from a cooking perspective, but also from a chef perspective, which is why she's here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the person I believe is the most likely to win Hell's Kitchen head chefs only at this current point is still Anthony. Now, obviously, there's a debate for Anthony being lower as he's obviously not on the winning team right now. His team is currently down by 2 and they've been losing a lot of services there. But I still feel like out of the people on the blue team, he's by far the person I feel the best about, where he gets a decent confessional after losing the challenge about how it feels like the ice cream man is driving away from him. And he does follow it up with a pretty quiet service, again, keeping his head down, not really making any mistakes. And I feel like he's someone that the audience is meant to sympathize with, someone who is meant to be one of the more serious people on the blue team, considering how chaotic they seem to be at this current point. I feel like his edit is consistent enough to where he's at least getting a check-in each episode without being overexposed, which I think is a positive there. And while he is complaining about how his team keeps losing, I feel like he's not really deriding anyone in particular. He's not really getting into the muck per se. He's just kind of showing the audience that this is just a bad situation, which I think makes him more sympathetic there. So I feel like Anthony's still someone I'm feeling pretty good about, even though his team is not doing well, which is why he's still here number 1. And there we go. That'll do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. Really helps with the channel. And I'll be back again next week to update the power rankings again, so you can look forward to that. And I'm covering Survivor 47 as well, so you can expect weekly power rankings of that show as well. I'm on Patreon and have a YouTube membership, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. And you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is a video. See ya.